there is a huge promise of technofix underway. And I'm afraid that technofixes do take the character of promises and they don't take the time to really see whether it works. In a way, we have a techno-optimism, meaning kneeling before the new god of innovation.
Welcome to Beyond the Fix. This podcast takes a closer look at the solutions that science and technology aim to offer to today's most pressing problems. Techno-optimism is the belief that technology will hold the key to solving global challenges. In this episode, we'll dive into this technofix narrative, what it is, where it came from, and who it benefits. I also want to explore alternative ideas that might offer different ways of tackling the multiple crises our ecosystems face. Finally, we'll touch on the precautionary principle and its relationship to such techno-optimism. I'm your host, Thomas Kobbel, and today I'm joined by a guest with over 5 decades of experience in a field where science, politics, and society intersect. Christine von Weizsäcker is a trained biologist and currently, among many other roles, President of Ecoropa, the European Network for Ecological Reflection. As such, she's often at the negotiating table when policy decisions are being made, like at the COP, the Global Climate Conferences. In other words, Christine is deeply familiar with how environmental policies are shaped in the corridors of power, and how crucial narratives and framings are in shaping how we think about the environment and, ultimately, the decisions that are made. Welcome to the show, Christine von Weizsäcker.
Thank you.
So today we're talking about the importance of narratives and framings, and it might sound a bit abstract. So let's start with some concrete definitions. What exactly is a technofix, and why should we care about it?
Well, I'm afraid that people who promote technofixes don't know exactly what they want to fix. So what they do is offer their field of expertise of technology generation and say it will solve at least one of the major problems, if not all. But we are in a time of multiple crises. You have the climate crisis, which is the most prominent of the environmental crises, but you also have biodiversity loss, which is perhaps that which will attack millions of people in their food supply, in their health, in their water supply. And you have social crises, very badly so. And you have north-south conflicts. And you have, and this is what the Europeans have to learn, there were wars all over the place all the time. But only when it comes close to us do we realize how destructive and critical these wars are. And that all technologies, more or less, are dual-use technologies, meaning they can be used for one thing or the other, for destruction, for warlike tools, and for beneficial tools, or tools that were thought to be beneficial but are not really. So this is a time when major players promote in the political fields, we are going to solve the problems. And here we come to, of course, major corporations and major innovative fields in science.
So can you maybe give one or two examples of what you consider to be a technofix?
Well, I'm afraid that the concentration on CO2 fixing only, and there you have not only planting small trees, but getting certificates for them, irrespective whether it's going to be healthy, diverse forest in 80 years. And many of these seedlings don't go. So the next round, of course, allows you to get certificates again and again. And it's like in the Middle Ages, where you paid an amount to remove your sins. So it's not really fixing the problem, but it's offering technofixes. And if you then go for, let's say, GMO trees, fixing more and growing in other areas where they couldn't grow grow before you get eucalyptus monocultures all over Africa. And so this is just one example.
Mhm.
Another example is at the moment upcoming, and that is the combination of the huge amount of ever cheaper and ever faster sequencing of hereditary material, meaning DNA, and putting them in large banks. And you have new genomic technologies, new gene technologies, which promise to be much more precise, which I doubt. And you have artificial intelligence. And now you have huge investments by the Silicon Valley multi-billionaires save the planet with that combination. So there is a huge promise of technofix underway. And I'm afraid that technofixes do take the character of promises and they don't take the time to really see whether it works.
Mm-mm.
So, in a way, we have a techno optimism, meaning kneeling before the new God of innovation. So, there are new, as you said, narratives. Innovation is one of the new words. Innovation sometimes is good, sometimes it's bad. And we have seen so many patents in the cellars of the patent offices that didn't work. So, not every innovation is a god, unquestionable. And secondly, you have the word ending bureaucracy, which means in order to push the technofixes, you remove all the critical assessment, the closer look, the wider context that these technofixes, these promises will end up in. So it's in a way an end of putting critical questions because, of course, we have the solution. And if we don't do it, everyone else will. The Chinese will do, the Russians will do it. And so you have this combination of innovation and getting rid of too much bureaucracy, which really is the narrative pushing for technofixes. And there is a lot of money in technofixes, whilst in considering the wider context of the multiple crises, which I started to describe, and they are very wide, you remove that and at least you say, well, artificial intelligence will do the wider context for us. But artificial intelligence didn't learn it. And also, the conditions of people on the ground, the communities they live in, the townships they live in, are locally, historically, ecologically contextualized and unique. So, a purely statistical picture of a technofix sorting it out for the majority of humans doesn't really take into account human rights and the specific solutions on the ground that people were able to provide so forcefully.
So if I'm trying to put this in a nutshell, right? So I mean, we do have problems. We do need to fix them or deal with them. So I have nothing against a good fix, right? So you would say the problem with technofixes is mainly that they don't work, or they just create new problems, or what's the problem with technofixes?
Well, they work in a certain context. If you only consider a small fraction of all the possible outcomes and variables, if you only consider shareholder value, for instance, which some do, then the technofix becomes very narrow and therefore it is bound to fail in many other contexts. So, what our science is lacking at the moment is the art of contextualization, which would mean that these little kingdoms of faculties and topics at universities would have to learn to talk to each other. And may I give you an example? I have been in so many interdisciplinary panels over the last decades. And it sometimes takes very intelligent professors 1, 2, or 3 years to accept the vocabulary of other faculties and not say, my vocabulary describes the real reality. So you should listen to physicists and economists trying to talk to each other. It takes its time and it takes really translation and listening and being self critical. But critical is exactly the point that we are missing in technofixes. Because critical thinking, I mean, Descartes lived at a time when there was a totalitarian state and a totalitarian religion. And he pulled himself out and said, I consider here and there, I doubt, and therefore I'm a scientist. But on the other hand, I sat in negotiations beside a woman representing industry in the negotiations on the access and benefit sharing protocol of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And she asked me, what's your organization? What do they do? And I dared to say critical reflection. And then she shouted at me, although the room was rather quiet, and said, we already learned at school that to be critical is a bad thing.
Wow.
So the scientists now are bound to come up with results. Universities are not paid, people are not paid for asking new questions or introducing new contexts, but give results.
So you would say there's two problems with our system of knowledge production, our universities. So first, there's a very narrow specialization, and also people have to publish or perish, right? So there's something broken with that system. Is that what
Yes,
you're saying, or am I?
publish and perish is an old thing. The new thing that are so many public-private partnerships at universities. There are so many patents applied for from universities, so that the independent critical function goes. In a way, universities are seen as a major factor in global competition. So they are economized in a way. And this, of course, also reduces the, and universities have to, in order to get money, they have to promise results. They don't have to promise new interesting questions. They don't have to promise the gaps in other publications. You never get a good doctoral thesis acknowledged if you criticize one of the main hypotheses of your professor. So we have nobody applauds new critical questions. And that would be the precondition for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary conversations, which we need in a multiple crisis.
So we see that starting from this notion of technofixing, it's quite a holistic thing that we're talking about. Maybe we can also talk about the second important concept in this conversation, the precautionary principle. I think it relates quite well to what you just said. What exactly is it?
Well, I dare to say that none of us would be here if our ancestors for millennia didn't apply the precautionary principle. They allowed their children to learn to climb on sofa beds and even put a mattress beneath. They didn't teach them to climb on the balcony of the fifth floor. So, this element of precaution is the precondition for learning. Even chemists in their labs are very careful not to allow their students to risk a lab explosion. So there is precaution there also, but the admiration for novelty, for innovation is so large that precaution is often forgotten. Now, unfortunately, There was a lucky moment when the Cold War stopped. In 1992, there was the Earth Summit in Rio, and this started the whole discussion on environment, development, sustainability. And one of the principles of Rio is the precautionary principle, which was established there, which basically says if there are strong indications that there will be severe or irreversible risks, then the states can act. That is all it says. Now, the European community has established the precautionary principle in its Rome statutes. In the US, it more or less disappeared in favor of what is called sound science, meaning that you have to prove the whole causal chain, then have scientific agreement, and then the state can act. And there has to be scientific consensus. So as long as some, let's say 2 or 3 institutes around the world say there is no climate change, there is no scientific consensus, even if they are paid for breaking the consensus. And this is why it's so hard for the Americans to act on certain things. So the precautionary principle was at the basis of the environmental agreements agreed in Rio in parallel. And that was the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. That was the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that was the Convention against Desertification. And in Rio, with all the optimism, everyone thought they would be in total harmony all the time. At the moment, it shows that it's not really so, and that there are conflicts to be resolved. And again, listening of one convention to the other needs to be done very much.
So, quite obviously, the precautionary principle is having a hard time. And I think this is maybe also because of 2 narratives that you mentioned earlier, right? One being, if we don't do it, somebody else, be it the Chinese or whoever, will do it. So we better apply it ourselves and can learn. And also what you mentioned, innovation, right? So that precaution is maybe seen as an enemy to innovation. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I had the chance to be invited to a European program run by 9 universities in Europe, which was called Recipes, meaning reconciling innovation and precaution with civil society engagement. And that was a very interesting meeting. And the precautionary principle barely did it because, in fact, environmental organizations, unions, consumers, they were all in favor, but they didn't have the institutes or the manpower to really push it. So I had to work very hard to formulate some defense for the precautionary principle, meaning that innovation running wild is not going to save the planet. Innovation in combination with protective and resilience, and as I call it, error-friendly considerations is utterly necessary. So there is a fight between the words innovation and the word transformation. And so you can type people according to the number of times they quote innovation and the number of times they quote transformation. And in most cases, environmental issues are better dealt with by people who are quoting transformation. That's a sort of statistical assessment of the two sets.
Can you maybe explain what the difference between these 2, let's say, camps is, or these 2 notions?
Well, innovation is really linked to technofixes. It means technofixes. Transformation means a systemic approach, considering the whole system and see how it can go from here to there without wars without disruptions, without killings, without major catastrophes. And so transformation means learning fast from smaller catastrophes than being forced to collapse after major catastrophes and having some people somewhere who will deal with the future.
To come back to precautionary principle one more time, you said something like innovation and precaution, they sort of need each other to have good outcomes, right? Which to me seems like very reasonable. But why? So why is precaution having such a hard time?
Because the crisis is so large and people want to keep living their lifestyles and go uninterrupted and unchanged. It's comfortable. So voters, governments are afraid of running against the statistical will of what the research institutes say about opinions in the country. So there is a sort of stalemate. And if somebody comes and say, I get you out of the stalemate, you can stay as you are, I'll do the technofix. This is very attractive. And I have in these negotiations of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which I have been attending for the last 30 years, there are 196 countries. Now, there are different interests and different interest groups. And of course, this is legitimate, but none of the interests should be seen as absolute. So it's totally okay if corporations tend and promise to increase their shareholder value. And you do that by making promises, not by actual performance in the next decades. It is absolutely understandable that powerless people, local communities, indigenous peoples insist on the protection by human rights, that they don't lose their land, and that land grabbing is not allowed. So there are many interests. The one group, the scientific and corporate group, is very much interested for historical reasons in innovation because this is what they were benefiting from. And other people need the fallback positions, the community life, the family coherence. They need healthy soils. They don't need the best harvest of the next year, but they need healthy soils for their children and grandchildren. So there are many conflicting interests around these terms, and it is interesting to follow who is in favor of the precautionary principle and who is not. So small island states, as they're sinking into the rising ocean level, they would have been very much for the precautionary principle. And by the way, also for another principle of Rio, which is the polluter-pays principle, meaning victims pay automatically. There needs to be a legal framework to make the polluters know what damage they do and to compensate for it or to avoid it. And then there is the closeness of the polluter-pays principle with the precautionary principle. Because if you run stupid risks and make stupid promises and you have to pay for the consequences, you realize the stupidity much earlier. And the third element, perhaps from Rio, which I would like to link to the other two, is Principle 10, which is called the democracy principle, meaning public information, public participation, and public access to justice in environmental matters. Fortunately, in Europe and recently also in Latin America, you have the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Convention, which basically guarantee these rights to their citizens.
So one thing that came to my mind, you said like there's this opposition of people who talk of transformation or of innovation, but maybe it's even transformation versus disruption, right? This is also what technofixes are also about, disruption.
Yes, of course. I mean, they The innovation was a very good trick to not have to use the Schumpeter word, a famous economist who was talking about disruption, but to tell the public we want disruptive technology, meaning getting rid of everything else, making tabula rasa and invade it with our innovation. This is not so attractive. Therefore, disruption was replaced for PR reasons with the word innovation.
This is also very closely related to techno-optimism, right? And I've come across something called the Huysmans' law of techno-optimism, which says that knowledge of a technology and optimism about it are inversely proportional. So the less we know about the technology, the more optimistic we tend to be, while experts who actually understand these technologies tend to have more modest expectations. Would you say this is maybe part of the problem with Technofixes, that many of these technologies are too complex for the general public to fully grasp, and so also leading to unrealistic expectations?
Well, you mentioned the word complex, and I've done systems theory. So the evolvement of a complex system is a system where all elements work together well and are interconnected. But now, in policy talk, complexity means it's too complex for the public to understand, leave it to the experts. So, complexity, instead of describing systems and being careful about well functioning systems that do exist and that came into existence and that evolve and change, hopefully, well, and they have the time to change well. Complex all of a sudden is an expertocratic word, meaning let the experts rule. You don't understand it. So I'm shocked always when I hear complex. This is too complex for the public to understand. Now, I have to say that even traditional fairy tales very often have more variables and are more complex than scientific theories with very small number of variables. People are fit to deal with complex systems. Families are complex. Environments are complex. Towns, politics are all very complex and have been complex all the time. People had and could deal with it. Now it becomes let the experts do the trick.
So I would like to stay there and ask you. I mean, we've talked about these framings and narratives now and how important they are. You mentioned disruption, who has been named as innovation, the complexity, etc. And I think you've learned from your decades of participating in high-level debates on biosafety, biosecurity, that such concepts or framings can have very tangible consequences and can be used strategically. Can you share some of your insights, what role such framings play in the political discourse, and maybe also some of the most notable examples?
Well, I don't know whether it's the most notable example, but in the Convention on Biological Diversity, you have a very strong establishment of the precautionary principle in paragraph 9 of the preamble, being valid for it all. And the whole Cartagena Protocol on biosafety is, in a way, based on the precautionary principle and the assessment necessities that follow from it. Because precaution means looking closely and looking critically. And therefore, the wording always was based on the best available scientific knowledge, meaning what we have, we should really use, but not everything is available yet. And perhaps there are gaps which certainly need to have closer scrutiny nowadays. It's called science based or evidence based, which means precaution goes because you have to prove that there is damage. You don't have to have serious indication of severe or irreversible risk, but you have to prove. And therefore, even if it's very dangerous and risky, like some experiments on pathogens, since you can't prove, you can't do the experiments to prove that they're dangerous, they will be allowed. So there is a shift, constant shift against precaution. And at a time when we would need a lot of precaution and wisdom and critical thinking, the comfortable belief in technofix promises rules the day.
And why would you say is that? Because as you just said, it's comfortable. I don't have to change anything. Or is it because this is applied very strategically?
Or both. I think both. It's very comfortable. If a technofixer promises you can live your life as you did, you don't have to change anything, and there is going to be progress all the time for the children and grandchildren, and we promise safety.
Who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, people want that. And even if the data show that getting the right curve in time for avoiding major catastrophes is the order of the day. And critical voices in science, questioning assumptions, widening the number of variables, talking to other people of other faculties and other continents and other walks of life is something that is not done because people also stay in their small discussion circles. And secondly, of course, we don't have to underestimate the role of PR, public relations, because there are major economists have described the asymmetries between players in the market. And the asymmetries, of course, are that the producers are stronger than the consumers and that the intermediaries, the traders, and the PR people are perhaps even more powerful and have larger power than the other two players. So there is a lot of investments in public relations, in reclame, in advertising, and in inventing narratives.
So, if you had the same power, what different narratives would you put forward?
I mean, to put it bluntly, I am consulting the people who cannot afford consultants. So this is a question that I don't ask myself. If I had the power, I would steer the world in a different direction. The whole point is to question power. Go with those who have asymmetries of power against them, whose voices are not heard. And this is a translation task. So we have very few people who translate, let's say, results of what you called, I'm dealing with high level negotiations. Actually, what I'm dealing is trying first, before the negotiations start, I get all the opinions and experiences from the ground and try to translate them into convention language, into international environmental law language. And at the end, I try to translate the results into the meanings for people on the ground. So that's my role. Therefore, I never ask myself the questions if I had the power to steer the world in my direction. I don't want that power. I don't want anybody to have the power to steer the whole world in their direction.
So, maybe to ask the same question in a bit different words, right? Because we discussed earlier on how compelling this story of ever continuing progress and safety, and you don't have to change your life, how compelling that is, right? Is there a different story that could maybe also be attractive that would not push that techno-fixing narrative that much?
Well, we have a problem that the word progress has been co-opted.
Mhm.
Of course, every ecosystem isn't fixed for eternity, but changes, adapts. You have to look at the history of the earth, how many changes there were, and how life adapted again and again. So, change and, in a way, progress and higher levels of complexity are an old story. Now, if progress has been redefined to narrow down on economic progress, meaning shareholder value and the value of your currency in the world market, And on technological progress, and let me say technological progress, if you define it in one technology or if you have technological progress in a systemic way, let's say technological progress in healing soils, then you have progress as well. But that's not called progress. It's called old fashioned very often. Although innovation in agroecology is one of the fastest advancing, progressing fields of knowledge, but that's not called progress because progress is a synonym and has been coined as a synonym of technofix.
So maybe one has to reclaim certain words and frames?
Sometimes it works, sometimes you have to give up and invent new words. It's like the word resilience, which in Latin really means jumping back to the position that it was in earlier. But resilience doesn't describe successful, long routes of evolvement, of paths, successful paths of change. And this is exactly what we need. Successful systemic pathways for change, because the problems change, they're becoming more burning, and we have a multiple crisis, as I said when we entered the discussion.
So the work that you are doing most probably feels like an uphill battle. Where do you draw your energy from to keep going?
Well, I mean, to put it bluntly, I have 13 grandchildren, and I can't tell my grandchildren, sorry, Granny is depressed. Look where you can survive and do your thing. So, as long as I live, I'll go on. That is what I owe to my children and grandchildren. It's very simple like that. And strangely enough, one must not underestimate the role of grannies in many cultures. So I was utterly surprised that a granny from Emmendingen in the Black Forest very often is chosen as an advisor by the Arab League countries, where you think the role of women, woo. Well, actually, before menopause, I wouldn't really appreciate being a member in that culture. But if you survived and it didn't break your spirit, you are a very sought after advisor as an old woman. So there are strange possibilities. And being powerless means also an advantage because I cannot force people or persuade them, flood them with arguments, and they have to listen to me because otherwise I can punish them. But they have to consider it, discuss it, criticize it, and then maybe they accept part of it. And I mean, my experience in these negotiations and in life is there are so many decent people around the world, amongst scientists, amongst farmers, amongst politicians, and they can find each other. But very often they don't look for each other, unfortunately.
So you have found your way. Do you have some advice for other people who want to make a difference?
A very simple advice is try, and if you fail, try again. And don't stop after the first mishap and the first lack of success. That is one point. And it is not predictable. The history in that way is not predictable. It's not predictable under which conditions all of a sudden certain arguments, certain groups, certain people get into the focus of attention. And so trying, and what I also try in order not to overload people is do what you can and then stop. And the stopping is as important as the doing as you can, because otherwise you don't have the breath to go all the way.
So don't get discouraged and look after yourself so you can go on. Christine von Weizsäcker, thank you so much for this inspiring talk.
It was my pleasure. And at some point, I was a serious scientist and I did information theory. And in that context on biological systems, the creativity is with the listener and not with the sender. So I appreciate everyone who listens. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In 2 weeks, we will talk with Ronny Emmenecker about deep geological repositories supposed to fix the problem of radioactive nuclear waste and the political geology they are based on. Beyond the Fix is brought to you by Critical Scientists Switzerland, an independent network of Swiss researchers, and is made possible by the Stiftung Mercator Schweiz. Music by Mich Gerber.